Thank you very much, Susanne, for the introduction. So what I'm going to speak to you about today is how you can prepare for a disruption by building a resilient supply chain. So as you've probably seen, there are certain events that you can't prepare for. I don't think that any company or normal-sized company could predict a pandemic. But I think if you look at your risk, if you look at your supply chain, there's very well things that you can assess, and you can actually highlight and identify potential risk within your supply chain. So if you look at the different events or risks that you have, you can actually qualify them. You can put them in a sense of probability, and you can put it in as a sense of impact on your organization. So if you are in a situation where you would potentially lose a large customer, this is a huge impact, and there might be a big probability of that. So do you actually have a game plan for that? Do you have a situation where you say, how low can we go? How far would we actually go for this customer? Is it still sustainable for us to keep with that customer, or should we actually let him go? What would that mean? Of course, also a high impact would be if you have a failure of your products while they're in the field. Again, do we have a plan for that? Do we have a process where we can actually do a recall? Do we have a process to do a hard recall? Do we have a process for a soft recall? And then, of course, also things that we can keep within the supply chain. For example, quality problems is something that we can look at to say, well, if we will start measuring our products, if we can actually see potential wear and tear on our tools, we can foresee that we can actually prevent that we have quality problems. So in case that you have several batches rejected, how can we actually deal with that? Do we have alternative sourcing, et cetera, et cetera. But of course also, if we talk about the extended supply chain, so not just within your own organization, but also to your suppliers, do you have single source? But if you do have single source, how close are you to these critical suppliers? Do you really know what's going on? And this is the importance. Or in case that you need a multiple supplier, in case that you need to go to another supplier, well, your competitor is, if he already talked to that supplier, he's going to be much quicker, because first you need to identify a supplier, you need to qualify a supplier, you need to talk about terms and conditions with the supplier, and the other thing is that you need to do a frame contract. That can take weeks, that can take months. While if you can actually prepare, if you can have a game plan from once that these events actually happen, that you can take that game plan out, fulfill a script, and actually say, okay, does this actually fit our situation? And these are the different steps that we have to take. For example, a hard recall or a soft recall. So you have things that you can prepare for, and you also have things that you can't prepare for. So think about those and try to qualify them. So this is what we're typically working on. So we're not just building a supply chain that is focusing on cost and service level, but also on cost, service level, and flexibility. So one thing is to understand your risk. The other thing is to understand that you have an issue. So here we are actually talking about latency. How long it's going to take me to get the information, to figure out that there's an issue that's building up. But actually also to highlight, yes, I do have an incident. But once you understand that you have an incident, you also need to collect the data. You need to understand the problem, and you need to make a decision. So once you have the insight, then you need to make a decision, and then you can actually put an action in place. Now, with today's technology, you have more insight, you have more data, but the data needs to be collected, it needs to be comprehended, it needs to be understood, and so that you actually have an action that you can take. Again, here we go back to the preparation, but also to get the information so that you know that you do have an incident. So I think this is quite important to really improve your reaction time and not just understand your risk. So if we look at disruption, so now we have our preparation. And if you actually look at this disruption, it typically follows the same pattern. And you see here, this is from a couple of professors that analyzed the curve of a disruption. And what we have is that on the first part, we have the preparation that we talked about before. And the preparation is here that's going to give you, once you have the disruption, the event, this is where you activate your initial response. This is what's going to keep you going, and hopefully going until the initial disruption might have gone away. This is where you set your initial buffers. And the first response is what's going to keep you afloat, hopefully also longer than your competition. Now, as you see that your first guards are coming down, now you see your initial impact. And people think, okay, it's going to go in this way, and then you typically see a drastic decline. This is where, or when all your guards basically fail, you can't get goods anymore. Yeah? And once you have that, this is where your speed of your recovery preparation is so important, is that your sales department, your production department, your purchasing department, and your controlling department, and your management can actually speak one language so they can prepare the recovery. That you don't need a lot of time to collect data, that you don't need a lot of time to understand the data, interpret the data, and also come up with different what-if scenarios. What if we do one or the other? That's the important part, that your recovery preparation is as short as possible, so that you can start your actual recovery. And at the end, you would have your long-term impact. Hopefully, it's going to be as small as possible. So, we talked about risk, we talked about the reaction time, and now we need to talk about how to actually build a resilient supply chain. And here we talk about the 5 facets of flexibility. Now, the first one is typically on your supply and your procurement side. So you need to decide, do I need to have a single supplier, or do I need to have multiple suppliers? Do you actually understand the upper limits of your suppliers? What we've seen a lot is that our customers, in the time of these pandemics, when they have in contact to the suppliers, they're not just talking about the demand that they have for the suppliers, they're actually talking about the constraints that they have. If we would order more, how much more can you actually give us? So they're having much more a conversation about the constraints in the supply chain and understanding the constraints in the supply chain, so you can actually highlight risk and then start going on multi-source, in case that you need to switch from one supplier to the other. The other thing is, of course, also to look at your own supply chain, to look at your own plants, your own conversion. And here, of course, cost and service level, it's the easiest to have one plant specializing on one finished good, on to producing this in the most efficient way, in the most cost-efficient way, with having the people specialized, the machine investment is less, and they can focus on just doing that. But the thing is that you might have to look at diversifying to say, well, I need an alternative. But that also means that you need alternatives in the other plant, and you need to have the machines that can produce the products, but you also need to have the tools to produce the products. And I think this is where you have to work and take a conscious decision to be more flexible to do that. And you also need to keep the skills within the plants up to date. So you probably have to do something like an 80-20 split to make sure that you're used in case that you actually switch around. And even more important is that if you do this, you need to make sure that you're actually not just have the contracts in place, but that you also have your master data in place. So in case that you need to switch from a demand-driven to a constraint-driven approach, that you actually have the master data and you have the alternative in your system. So in case that you need to switch from a backwards planning to a forward planning, that you can actually tell the system what the alternatives are. Because otherwise, you can't really get any help. Otherwise, you can't get any quick reaction time. Because you have to make up everything as you get along. This is what the preparation also means, is that you build in the alternatives also into your systems, and not just as talking and thinking about what the options would be. Then it might be too late. Again, also, as we're talking about a constrained environment, how would you actually then distribute? So in case that you have a constrained amount of finished good, how would you distribute it? Do you actually have the ability to do a fair share or to do a prioritization of the demand? To say, my customer orders are more important than my stock refills. Because otherwise, it will just go by date. It will be first come, first serve. So it's important to have mechanism. You can actually say, let me prioritize, and when I have the different categories of prioritization, that you actually go in and you're able to do a fair share, to keep your supply chain as in total afloat as long as possible, so that you can actually work on the initial problem to get up to speed again, so that you can fill your supply chain. And the other thing that's in here is actually also, how do I commit delivery dates? How do I commit to your customer? Because what we've seen, as soon as the pandemic came, everybody was hamstering, and it was basically first come, first serve. So people were buying raw material, were buying components from our customer like crazy. Yeah? And if you weren't quick enough, then you got up to 75 weeks of delivery time because everybody else was locked in before. And I've seen a customer where a basic fan made out of plastic had to come from China. It took 73 weeks for them to get, meaning they had a delivery time to their own customers with 83 weeks. Nobody is expecting these kind of things. So you need to be able to work with allocations to the customer, say, who are my important customers? Am I allocating capacity? Am I allocating products to these customers so that you can actually keep your important customers afloat and say everybody, and not just a first come, first serve. So here your ATP check, your available to promise check, your commitment on delivery date also comes in as a safeguard. It's not just about the physical things that you do in your supply chain, like tools and machines, but it's also the way that you address the situation of working in a constrained environment. The fourth one is, of course, a control system. So you need to be able to have a system that collects all of this data, but this data also needs to be worked in a what-if scenario, because you have to work very quickly different scenarios out, and it needs to be an exercise between sales, between production, between procurement, between controlling, to say what is the best decision for the company as a whole. And this is what you need to focus on, and not just saying, great, I got a new contract from sales, he's happy, and everything else is just open afterwards. Yeah? Say, perfect, they're hamstring, let's just take the orders and we figure it out later. That's just going to disappoint everybody else from there on. And the other thing that we have here is number 5, is the right culture. Do you have a common language? Are you able to translate a demand signal into a capacity signal, into a raw material signal? And are you able to work in different scenarios? This is one of the things, and you also have the meeting and the meeting structures that you make decisions as a company, and not just department by department. So I have one example here. And what I work with my clients on is very often called an S&OP process. It's a long-term process where the purpose of the process is to set boundaries. It's to decide on our capabilities. Capabilities in the form of capacity, and its capability in form of inventory. To say, what is it that we need to be ready to do? But in case that you have, we call this the 800-pound gorilla scenario, you have a very big customer coming in and say, I want thousands of parts, and I want them now, otherwise you're gone. So he puts a lot of pressure on the organization, and you should not just take the order and be happy about it. You need to know the impact, and you need to know whenever you're outside of your boundaries. Because a typical standard S&OP process would be there's a demand review, there's a supply review, then there's a balancing where the subject matter experts are actually talking about different mitigation actions. And then after that, there's an executive, because it needs to be a decision also on the executive level to say, this is the plan forward. But in a mini S&OP, if we have a disruption that is outside of our buffers, this is where you actually trigger the mini S&OP process. So now we're not talking about a month, now we're talking about days. And the thing is that on day one, we need to look at the demand. We need to make sure, is this really an order that we want to take? Or do we need to take the first level of defense to say, well, the customer might want thousands of parts tomorrow, but does he really need them? Can we negotiate a split delivery? So 20%, 20%, 20% over a certain time. The next one is, of course, then on the supply. Do I even have buffer in my production? What would the impact actually be on my other customers if I take this order and only tailor to this? I see so often that the customers are more reacting instead of actually proactively trying to plan and trying to get it much smoother. Because the more that you react on these kind of things, the more expensive your production is, because you need to change around all the time. So again, take into consideration, do I even have the capacity? Can I even maybe take on a contract manufacturer? Do I have any alternatives? We talked about the preparations before. You need to be able to have it within your system what your options actually are. And if you do not, you need to be able to model them to come up with new solutions, which this would be. We need to come up with new solutions if we can commit to this order or not. The balancing, you probably know, this is where supply and demand work together to actually come up with the best scenario. And again, if something comes in here, it's probably better to have the executive level also approving the actual plan. Yeah. So this is one scenario on how you actually can deal with disruption. Again, what you need is that you need to assess the risk. You need to come up with a quick reaction time. You need to know where you need to be at a certain point. And of course, also you need to have your supply chain being mitigated. I have to do a little advertising for Nitesh that's coming, because one of the things that we're working on is actually to figure out if we have a shipment that's late, that means that we actually constrained so that we can turn around and say, okay, we are not demand-driven anymore, we actually now constraint-driven because I have a late delivery. What are we actually going to do? So this is one of the things that I would like you guys to look at, and then think about what I just told you about here, to say we need to know where we need to be, and we need to know when we have a disruption. So this is the latency, and we need to have a game plan. So once we see this disruption, what are the next steps? And those game plans should not just be in a drawer, they should also be depicted in the actual system. So that's basically what I had today. Susanne, thank you very much.
Lars, thank you very much, especially for sharing. Exactly. That's worth a round of applause. for sharing with us the 5 facets of flexibility. If you would have to choose the most important one, is there one, or are they completely equal?
They're somewhat equal, but there's different things that needs to be done in the physical world. It's something that you can't just plan your way around for. So you need to have the machines, you need to have the tools, and you need to have the people that are trained to produce the different products in your plants. If you don't do that physically, there is no flexibility. Then you can do all the theoretical options within your system that you can then switch around. It wouldn't work. But of course, if you want to speed up things, that's where you need to prepare for the master data, for the transactional data, and all of that stuff, so that you actually know so you can understand the data and understand the options that you have, and then make a decision quicker than your competitor.
Perfect, Lars. Thank you very much.
Thank you.